This is a CBS News Special Report. I'm Norah O'Donnell in Washington, and we are coming on the air as President Biden is about to speak to the nation and the world about a ceasefire and hostage deal between Israel and Hamas. And here's what CBS has learned about the agreement. It includes the release of Israeli hostages and American hostages in waves and requires additional aid, humanitarian aid, to flow into Gaza. This is a complex deal that comes after 15 months after Hamas launched a terror attack in Israel, killing 1,200 and taking hundreds hostage. You can see now the President of the United States. Let's listen.
It's a very good afternoon, because at long last, I can announce a ceasefire and a hostage deal has been reached between Israel and Hamas. For more than 15 months of conflict, it began with Hezbollah's brutal massacre on October the 7th. More than 15 months of terror for the hostages, their families, the Israeli people. More than 15 months of suffering by the innocent people of Gaza. Fighting in Gaza will stop, and soon the hostages will return home to their families. The elements of this deal were what I laid out in detail this past May, which was embraced by countries around the world and endorsed overwhelmingly by the UN Security Council. The deal is structured in 3 phases. Phase 1 will last 6 weeks. It includes a full and complete ceasefire, withdrawal of Israeli forces from all the populated areas of Gaza, and the release of a number of hostages held by Hamas, including women and elderly and the wounded. And I'm proud to say Americans will be part of that hostage release in Phase 1 as well. And the Vice President and I cannot wait to welcome them home. In exchange, Israel released hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. And during Phase 1, the Palestinians can also return to their neighborhoods in all the areas of Gaza. And the surge of humanitarian assistance into Gaza will begin. And the innocent people can have a greater access to these vital supplies. You know, during the next 6 weeks, Israel will negotiate the necessary arrangements to get Phase 2, which is a permanent end of the war. Let me say it again, a permanent end of the war. There are a number of details to negotiate to move from Phase 1 to Phase 2, but the plan says if negotiations take longer than 6 weeks, the ceasefire will continue as long as the negotiations continue. I've spoken to the Emir of Kuwait and the President of Egypt, and we have pledged to make sure the negotiations will keep moving forward for as long as it takes. Then, when Phase 2 begins, there will be an exchange for release of the remaining living hostages, including male soldiers, and all remaining Israeli forces will be withdrawn from Gaza, and the temporary ceasefire will become permanent. And finally, Phase 3, any final remains of hostages who have been killed will be returned to their families, and a major reconstruction plan for Gaza will begin. This is the ceasefire agreement I introduced last spring. Today, Hamas and Israel have agreed to that ceasefire agreement and the whole ending the war. You know, those of you who have followed the negotiations can attest, the road to this deal has not been easy. I've worked in foreign policy for decades. This is one of the toughest negotiations I've ever experienced. And we reached this point because of the pressure that Israel built on Hamas, backed by the United States. Hamas's longtime leader, Sinwar, was killed. Hamas's strongest supporter, Iran, launched attacks on Israel. And those attacks failed after my administration organized a coalition of nations to stop them. And after I ordered the U.S. ships and planes to come to Israel's defense, we also shaped Israel's strong and calibrated response, destroying Iran's air defenses, but avoiding an escalatory cycle of an all-out war. The United States also organized a coalition of 20 countries to stand up to attacks by the Houthis, including their missile attacks in Israel. Then Hezbollah, another of Hamas's strongest backers, was significantly weakened on the battlefield. and its leadership was destroyed. With our support, Israel negotiated a ceasefire with them, and after that, Lebanon finally elected a new president who's not beholden to Hezbollah, and he can begin a new chapter for the Lebanese people. All told, these developments in the region, which the United States helped to shape, changed the equation. And so now, the terror network that once protected and sustained Hamas is far weaker. Iran is weaker. Iran is weaker than it's been in decades. Hezbollah is badly degraded. And after more than 15 months of war, Hamas's senior leaders are dead. Thousands of Hamas fighters are dead. And the military formations have been destroyed. With nowhere to turn, Hamas finally agreed to releasing hostages. You know, there was no other way for this war to end than with a hostage deal. And I'm deeply satisfied this day has finally come, for the sake of the people of Israel and the families waiting in agony, and for the sake of the innocent people in Gaza who suffered unimaginable devastation because of the war. The Palestinian people have gone through hell. Too many innocent people have died. Too many communities have been destroyed. In this deal, the people of Gaza can finally recover and rebuild. They can look to a future without Hamas in power. You know, the Bible says, blessed are the peacemakers. Many peacemakers helped make this deal happen, including an extraordinary team of American diplomats who have worked nonstop for months to get this done. Secretary Blinken led the effort. Secretary Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Bill Burns, John Feiner, Brett McGurk, Amos Hochstein, and the Vice President worked relentlessly as we worked to deliver this deal. I'd also note this deal was developed and negotiated under my administration, but its terms will be implemented, for the most part, by the next administration. In these past few days, we've been speaking as one team. This has been time of real turmoil in the Middle East. But as I prepare to leave office, our friends are strong, our enemies are weak, and there's genuine opportunities for a new future. In Lebanon, there's an opportunity for a future, free from the grip of Hezbollah. In Syria, a future free from the tyranny of Assad. And for the Palestinian people, a credible pathway to a state of their own. And for the region, a future of normalization, integration of Israel and all its Arab neighbors, including Saudi Arabia. At the G20 in Delhi in September 23, I rallied key countries behind a vision of an economic corridor from India across the Middle East to Europe. That vision can now become a reality. There are risks as well, including ISIS and Iran, even in a badly weakened state. But we're handing off then to the next team a real opportunity for a better future for the Middle East. I hope they will take it. Let me close with this. My friend for years in the United States Senate, former Senator George Mitchell, who did so much to forge peace in Northern Ireland, once said about diplomacy, he said, it is a 700 days of failure and 1 day of success. 700 days of failure and 1 day of success. Well, we've had many difficult days since Hamas began its terrible war. We've encountered roadblocks and setbacks. We've not given up. And now, after more than 400 days of struggle, a day of success has arrived. God bless all the hostages and their families. May God protect the troops of all those who work for peace.
Mr. President, how do you see the future of Gaza now? As you were saying, the implementation of this deal will be in the hands of the next administration, and basically they will shape the future of Gaza. So how do you see this future? And also, how much credit do you give to the Trump team for this deal? Trump is already taking credit for it.
Well, you know, this is the exact framework of the deal I proposed back in May. Exact. And we got the world to endorse it. Secondly, it's America's support for Israel that helped them badly weaken Hamas and its backers. And create the conditions for this deal. And thirdly, I knew this deal would have to be implemented by the next team, so I told my team to coordinate closely with the incoming team to make sure we're all speaking with the same voice, because that's what American presidents do. Thank you.
In the, how many Americans will be released when the hostages are being released?
All the exact detail of how many people are being held, how many bodies will be returned and less, will all be forthcoming. All of it, all of it. Thank you.
This deal will hold.
I'm confident. Thank you.
Who takes credit for this, Mr. President, you or Trump?
Is that a joke? Oh, thank you.
And there you have it. The President of the United States, flanked by his Secretary of State and the Vice President, Kamala Harris, announcing this historic deal. It is a three-phase deal that will begin on Sunday and will begin the process of returning home some of these Israeli hostages and American hostages and this ceasefire. I want to bring in Face the Nation moderator Margaret Brennan. I know you have been working the phones for days and a lot certainly this morning. Explain how it will work.
So this is a very complex three-phase deal. As President Biden said, this is what he went public with, but it was all aspirational at the time. And let's be clear, just getting to yes was a huge lift. Negotiators were talking up to 3 a.m. Wednesday in Doha. Notably, in the room, Biden and Trump envoys, very much side by side with Israel, but the negotiators couldn't be in the same room with Hamas. You had the Israelis on one floor with the Americans, Hamas on another. They did get to yes, but we are already seeing just how politically complicated implementation of this will be. Some very welcoming statements in Doha, Qatar, from the President of the United States, but in Israel, the Prime Minister issuing a statement saying they need more details. That may be a nod, Norah, to details we'll get later today. The list of Palestinian prisoners who will be released from Israeli detention haven't been made public yet, and we could see legal challenges to it. That's just to say, getting to yes was huge, but getting this to actually work will also be a massive diplomatic undertaking. We don't yet know who Donald Trump will charge with overseeing these details. You hear Qatar and Egypt say on their end they will get Hamas to follow through, but this is a step-by-step process. Yes, in phase one, you should see some Americans, but you won't see them walk out on day one. If the timeline lines up, the Palestinian list comes out today, you could see a challenge go to the Israeli Supreme Court. In the best case scenario, the first release would be by Sunday. You could then see 3 to 4 women released. But this is every few days. A little something here, a little something there. And remember, we were just 8 days into the last hostage deal when it all fell apart. The hope this time is that they can get to phase 2 and 3, and that you could eventually see a full-scale withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza. But that's a really big if. Right now, what we have is an agreement to let some aid in, some hostages out, and some Palestinian prisoners. So this may be a phase 1 deal. Biden, in his legacy, wants this to be seen through, but he's handing that over to Donald Trump to implement. And we'll have to watch just how successful this can actually be. It is a massive deal for him, and he made this big push right after the election. Norah.
I want to get your take, given your level of expertise and speaking with everyone, given that Donald Trump has said all hell will break out if there's not a deal, given that both presidents have their envoys working side by side, does it make it more likely that we could see this through, that maybe we could get to phase 2 when those male soldiers would be released and so many families waiting for them to come home, as well as the women, the wounded, and the elderly that will be part of phase 1?
That's what's been so, frankly, impressive, because it's so unusual to see them working side by side. One team representing the U.S. is the phrase they're using. Donald Trump doesn't want this on his plate. He doesn't want this on his inbox. This has been just such a horrifically bloody and brutal war in the Middle East that has reverberated throughout. He wants to see this through, and that has been really useful, the negotiators tell me, at the table, because the parties in the region do fear that while they can say no to Joe Biden, they know Donald Trump wants it, and that there could be consequences, particularly useful when pressing Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who is politically embattled and under a lot of pressure from his right flank not to agree to pull Israeli troops out of Gaza and actually to annex that territory. Yeah. Trump is pushing back on that. So it's a very interesting dynamic, but we could see implementation. That's going to be up to the hands of the diplomats. We're going to be down in the details. That's why we have to see who he appoints. Right now, it is real estate magnate Steve Witkoff, who was there with seasoned diplomats. We don't know who will be there really pressing day to day to make sure that this happens.
So much to discuss. I want to touch base with our correspondents in the region because we have been watching Gaza in Israel and in Israel, I should say, since this deal was announced. Take a look at this, celebrations. This video, you can see people flooding into the streets in celebration. The Hamas-run health ministry saying more than 47,000 Palestinians have been killed since the fighting began 15 months ago. And if this ceasefire holds, it could mean a flood of humanitarian aid into the region. I want to bring in CBS News foreign correspondent Ramy Inocencio. He's been on the ground covering this war since the beginning and is in Tel Aviv tonight. And what are the hostages' families telling you?
Sure. Norah, well, a statement by the families of American hostages was just released, and it is a mix of emotions. On one hand, they're expressing their gratefulness to the outgoing Biden administration, but they're also expressing anxiety about the future of their own families. You both were just talking about whether this phase 1 into phase 2 into phase 3, whether this process will hold. They are still unsure whether that will happen. And as we know that there are 7 Israeli Americans among these 98 Israeli hostages, and 3 of those are still believed to be alive. We expect, though, that those 3 will not come out over the first phase, over the first 6 weeks. But again, they're hopeful, interestingly, hopeful specifically that under President Trump's leadership, they say that every last hostage will come home. With the people that I've been talking to, the families of hostages, they've been saying that it is also a complicated mix of emotions. One brother of one of the hostages, Eli David, messaged me and said that he thinks that this is, that he's not happy about it because his brother, a male, of course, won't be in that first tranche, in that first group, in this first phase 1. He said that he is, of course, hopeful. He's excited for phase 2. But again, people just aren't sure whether we can get past the first few days, the first few weeks. So still, there has been this kind of hopeful anxiety, anxious hope, if you will, in the lead up to this deal over the past several days. And that kind of anxious hope still carries on until, of course, those loved ones and those hostages finally are able to hug each other again.
No doubt, Ramy Inocencio. And Margaret has some additional details to add to that. Margaret.
So the first American we might see is Keith Siegel, who is over the age of 50. That's the benchmark for military service. He would come out in phase 1 if this moves forward. We just wouldn't expect to see him until about day 7 or beyond. 2 of the others are more complicated because they are of military age. But there are 2 other male hostages, one of them a member of the IDF, that would potentially shift to a later phase. But we could see 2 of the 3 Americans released in the first phase, the first 6 weeks.
Thank you, Margaret. I want to bring in White House reporter Weijia Jiang. And Weijia, we heard the president talking about the extraordinary cooperation between this outgoing administration and the incoming administration. Talk about what you know about that. The president making clear that he wanted this to work.
Well, he's relying on them. He's depending on the Trump administration for this to work, Norah, which is exactly why from the very beginning when it was clear that Trump had won, it was the national security advisors and appointees that Trump had named who were brought into the fold first whenever other counterparts were not even having conversations, and why Margaret laid out exactly why they will be critical in carrying out this plan. And this is an announcement, Norah, that President Biden has been waiting for so long to make. It has been hanging over him. And the the timing is fortuitous for him because in just a few hours, he will be delivering a farewell speech to the nation that is also, of course, a final declaration of his accomplishments. And this certainly reframes that, and we expect he will be talking at length about the success of this deal, which he said was the result of dogged and painstaking American diplomacy. But Norah, President-elect Trump has also weighed in, and he says in a statement that this epic ceasefire agreement could have only happened as a result of our historic victory in November, as it signaled to the entire world that my administration would seek peace and negotiate deals to ensure the safety of all Americans. President Biden was asked about the fact that Trump is already taking credit for this, and his response was simply to point out that the agreement that was reached was his exact framework that he introduced in May. And then when he was asked more pointedly who is responsible for this, him or Trump, he said, was that a joke? But aside from the rhetoric and the politics, what matters most is that Biden reiterated that he has stressed to his team to work closely in coordination with the Trump team, because at the end of the day, you're talking about the United States and its place and its role, Norah, in brokering this historic agreement.
Weijia Jiang at the White House. Thank you. So much at stake, more than a president's legacy here, the lives of so many people in the Middle East, and what many people hope for, which is perhaps a transformation, a normalization of relations somewhere down in the future between Israel and some of these Arab states, too, if this ceasefire agreement and this three-phase deal can hold. And so we will continue to cover every detail of this on CBS News 24/7, your local news. And we'll have more tonight, including analysis on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Norah O'Donnell.